Hi, I'm Skinny Cheeks. We recently got the Week 5 PTS patch notes for Update 35, and I think most of this stuff in here is pretty good. However, there are a couple of big issues that definitely need to be addressed from ZOS, so in this video, we'll just walk through all the upcoming changes, and I'll give my feedback along the way. The first is an addition to the target dummy. By popular request, the raid target dummy now has elemental catalyst active on it to help improve accuracy of results for both magicka and stamina focused team compositions. So this is something I was really hoping they would add a bit less about the magicka versus stamina and more about those light armor users out there. With the dummy having that full 6k penetration from Alkosh, it really tilted things in favor of medium armor, which still seems to be the more optimal route, but now those in light armor have a more realistic representation of crit damage levels that they might see in an organized raid. And then they do have a note here, and I think what they're saying is that the elemental catalyst bonus is hard-coded on the dummy, so it will stack with the actual set. Just keep that in mind. I don't think that many people parse on the dummy with elemental catalyst anyways, so it really shouldn't matter too much, but there will be that weird interaction if you do. Moving on to Dragonknights, Seething Fury, which is the passive that you get when slotting Molten Whip, increased the duration to 15 seconds up from 10 seconds to help it be easier to keep up with the new durations of Fiery Breath and Searing Strike. So yeah, nice little buff here. So if we do go back to the week 1 patch notes, they actually changed this to give 100 weapon and spell damage per stack now, so 300 at max stacks instead of 225. Now having this bumped up to 15 seconds instead of 10 just lets us hold that a little bit longer or keep it up at all times a little bit easier if we want to set up our rotation around that. Definitely a welcome change in my opinion. On to Nightblades, we got a few changes here. First off, Impale. This morph now increases the execute scaling to 330%, up from 300%, so a small buff here for the ranged magicka morph. Killer's Blade, the melee stamina morph, was changed in week 1 of the PTS to essentially be the same as Executioner, the two-handed execute ability. Same tooltip, same scaling. The only real difference is the heal that you get if your target dies with Killer's Blade. So I'm happy to see the buff here to Impale, but I'm still not crazy about Killer's Blade essentially being almost a straight copy paste from Executioner. Next up is Twisting Path. They definitely heard the feedback on this one, and the patch notes say it is a 50% buff from where it was previously. If we take a look at last week on the PTS, where Twisting Path ended up on the list of Nightblade's overtime skills, it was pretty far down the list, which made me pretty sad. But with the new updated value, it looks to sit in a much healthier spot for a class AoE dot in my opinion. One thing I did notice though, it does look like it was a 30% buff from last week, not a 50% buff. The base tooltip went from 290 per tick up to 377. Not sure if it was originally going to be 50% and then they changed it or what happened there, but either way, even at 30%, it's still a nice buff. It's still worth running. It's going to be slotted as a DPS. Next, we have changes to both morphs of Veiled Strike. First, we'll cover Surprise Attack. This morph's guaranteed critical strike now can only occur once every 4 seconds to prevent it from adding too much sustained burst. Personally, for PvE anyways, I really didn't think this skill was overtuned. It did require flanking, and with the general levels of crit chance that we normally sit at in our builds, it wasn't upping the skill to an amount that I would consider to be overpowered. So it is likely for PvP reasons that it was nerfed to this new format. It still should be a pretty solid spammable option though. I need to test it up against rapid strikes to see which one of those will win out, and also probably worth pointing out, when I first read this, I read it as 1 out of every 4 surprise attacks would be a guaranteed crit, but it's actually just a 4-second cooldown, so that will be resetting while you're casting other skills as well, so it isn't quite maybe as bad as it initially looks if you just look at that once every 4 seconds, because it will be resetting while you're casting your dots, your bow procs, and things of that nature, so you'll still be gaining a fair bit of extra crits from having this morph. Now the real kicker is with the other morph, Concealed Weapon. This one got a really juicy buff, so I'm not sure how many will want to go the surprise attack route for PvE anyways. This morph now increases your damage done by 10% for 5 seconds after leaving stealth or invisibility or when major expedition ends, rather than granting 300 weapon and spell damage for 15 seconds after leaving stealth or invisibility. Note the in-combat requirement for this still remains. Since Twisting Path refreshes major expedition on the user while that is up, essentially you can keep this passive bonus up indefinitely as long as you are keeping up your Twisting Path. That does appear to be an intended interaction as well based on the riddle. If your path is fraught with darkness, all shall be illuminated. While Twisting Path's base morph is called Path of Darkness, so I think that makes it pretty clear that this is an intended interaction. So we'll see how this affects Nightblade's power overall. I don't see how Surprise Attack could possibly match up to this for PvE purposes, but Nightblade was also not overperforming, so maybe this puts them in a pretty good spot overall. We'll have to test it out and see. Then the last Nightblade change we have is to Dark Cloak. This morph once again heals for max health per tick rather than missing health. Reduce the base healing by approximately 42% compared to the live version. This morph now has a new added functionality where the heal over time is increased by 150% when not moving. So I've had time to sit with this now, and I think it's pretty interesting actually. This is the opposite morph of the popular invisibility skill Shadowy Disguise, so in choosing to forego your key stealth ability and instead taking this healing morph, you're kind of changing up your identity a little bit as a Nightblade, a little bit away from the hides in the shadows kind of route, and more in the stand your ground and fight sort of playstyle. This Dark Cloak morph is especially popular for PvE tanking, and previous updates on the PTS changed the heal to be based on missing health, and that really hurt the skill a lot. So I think this is a pretty interesting route to go. It kind of doubles down on that decision to forego your stealth by making you actually have to stand still to get the most healing out of it. You still heal if you're moving, so you still get a heal. It's just not as good as on live, but if you want that juicy 150% boost, which actually makes it a sizable buff from what we have on live, then you have to stop for a moment and regain your composure while you heal up. I wasn't too impressed when I first read this, but I think it is, like I said, it's grown on me a little, and I think overall it is a good direction to go with the skill. Next up we have Sorcerers, the Crystal Weapon morph. Increase the damage of the second hit of this ability to 45% of the original hit's damage, up from 30%. So I think this tooltip is now in a pretty good spot. It is slightly ahead of Rapid Strikes in overall damage, which is fair since some of that damage is delayed and not guaranteed since it relies on excellent light attack weaving to maximize it. So to me, it now feels like the choice is no longer about should I use Crystal Weapon or a different spammable, but instead should I use the Crystal Weapon morph or the Crystal Fragments morph? And I think both options are definitely viable, and while the Crystal Fragments morph probably does have the higher top end potential overall, Crystal Weapon does offer that nice 1k penetration debuff to go along with it. Another thing that I think often gets overlooked with Crystal Weapon is the extra self-healing you end up getting from the Blood Magic passive. Since the damage from Crystal Weapon is staggered, if you are weaving this ability every other skill, you are essentially always dealing damage with it, and therefore you have a very nice, reliable incoming heal. Whereas with the other morph, Crystal Fragments, it's a bit more spaced out and much less noticeable. So overall, much better spot for this skill to land in after being really overtuned on the live servers, but over-nuked in the earlier PTS patches. And then the other Sorcerer change is with the Daedric Prey morph. Increase the bonus to your pet's damage to 45%, up from 20%. I saw a lot of people laughing about this because Prey was nerfed in the past down to 20%, but now it's going back up. But remember, with this PTS, Sorcerer pets were nerfed, and the Atronach ultimate was also heavily nerfed. So keeping that 20% the same, it was creating a situation where the Haunting Curse morph was better to run even on the 2-pet build. Prey was still the mathematically better option while your Atro ultimate was active, but the duration of that ultimate was shortened and the overall damage tuned down. So overall, averaging out the damage, Haunting Curse came out ahead of Daedric Prey even with those 2-pet setups. So now with this adjustment, Haunting Curse should be the clear winner with no pets. It should give pretty similar results to Daedric Prey with a 1-pet setup, and then it should perform worse than Daedric Prey if you have 2 pets, which seems to me like they struck a pretty nice balance between the two morphs. This will make prioritizing Daedric Prey super important when your Atronach ultimate is out. With that 45% boost, you really won't want to miss any buffed up ticks at all, so keeping Prey going will be far and away your #1 priority skill with that Atro ult going. The only real negative I'll say is that this does continue to reinforce the idea that pets are kind of a must on Sorcerers if you want to really maximize your damage for PvE. I think it would be cool if they introduced some kind of lone wolf type of buff where you have some kind of increase to your damage if you don't have any summoned pets out. Even if the pets are slightly the more optimal route overall, having the no pet setup a little closer would be a huge win for a lot of Sorcerers out there that like to play into the other aspects of their class more and aren't really big fans of relying on the Daedric summons. Alright, moving on to Templars with Radiant Destruction. Increase the base damage of this ability and its morphs by approximately 23% to ensure it stands up to execute abilities when looking at their ability to be more frequently weaved with. So this is a very nice buff for Templars. The max ticks on the few dummy parses I've seen so far are super high, and this just reinforces this skill a little more as a staple for nuking down opponents in execute range as a Templar. Moving on to Wardens, the Screaming Cliff Racer morph increased the bonus weapon and spell damage for hitting off-balance targets to 300 up from 200. So this will now be a total of 400 weapon and spell damage added whenever the target is off-balance from using this ability. This sounds pretty nice. If maximized by casting at the beginning and the end of off-balance, you should be able to get pretty good uptime on that 400 weapon and spell damage. Next is Arctic Blast. Increase the chances of applying a status effect with this morph to 15% up from 1% per tick. This is pretty nice too. So now both your Winter's Revenge and your Arctic Blast abilities are going to have a way higher chance to proc Chilled and also Brittle if you're using an Ice Staff. And then speaking of Winter's Revenge, this morph now deals 30% more damage if you cast it with a Destruction Staff equipped to help Magicka-focused Wardens get some extra sustained damage. I'm kind of undecided on this one, to be honest. I don't dislike the concept, but at the same time it does feel a little bit strange. I could understand if they said with a Frost Staff equipped, because that would line up with the element, but I don't know. It's still a nice buff to those that were using it with the staff, and overall it's an okay AoE option. Outside of that, probably if you're not using a staff, you'll only use it for AoE heavy encounters, not for single target encounters. But if you do have a staff on, then it's probably a must-run skill for single target and AoE damage. And that's it for the class adjustments. Next up we have Carve. Increased the duration of the final stack to 32 seconds up from 30 to grant it a better grace period in a real rotation when paired with other duration effects. So this is great. Yeah, it looks like more feedback was heard here. They wanted it to line up well with the 15-second duration from Stampede. So now you have that little bit of a grace period to recast it with Stampede every other time and not let the skills stacks fall off. Next is Resolving Vigor. Reverted the healing reductions made to this morph. It now grants minor resolve rather than major resolve to prevent the skill from harming class identity and importance to run other sources of this buff. So I was a little confused when I first read this, but it does seem like they don't want it interfering with all of the class skills that do give you major resolve, like Lightning Form on a Sorcerer or Spiked Armor on a Dragonknight. Since there are less sources of minor resolve, I think this probably makes sense and should be pretty nice for solo play where you won't be getting this buff from a support already. It also stacks with major resolve now from Oakensoul, which is a nice little boost if you are using Resolving Vigor. Alright, now let's move on to the gear set changes. Crushing Wall, this is the Maelstrom Staff. This set is now increasing the damage of your wall of elements by 1250 rather than increasing the damage done with your light and heavy attacks against enemies and your wall of elements by 1358. I know some people are not a fan of this change because for one, this is going away from what the staff has always done, and for two, it does take away some of the skill involved to get the most out of it. And while I do understand those points of view, I actually personally don't mind this change. For pure single target damage, if you are weaving very well at one light attack with each skill every second, you will see a small DPS decrease from the value going down to 1250 instead of 1358. However, now that the effect comes from the wall itself, as soon as you have more than one target, your damage from this arena set should be better, and that just increases even more with the more targets that you have. We haven't really had a great backbar option for arena staves for AoE encounters, especially trash pools, so this should work very nicely for that now. And that bonus of 1250 also applies to the explosion portion of Unstable Wall. So if you did like to run a setup that uses Unstable Wall as your AoE spammable, maybe you're building mostly single target on the front bar, but you still like to use that back bar wall for AoE situations, it should be a nice buff for the set there too. They did decrease the base damage of this by 33% a couple of weeks back, but if you're using the Maelstrom Staff, this will more than make up for that decrease. There are some negatives to this change, yes, but I think overall the new benefits will outweigh those. But I totally get if you don't agree. I think this is one of those things that some will prefer one way and some the other. Next up is Merciless Charge. This is the Maelstrom two-hander. Reduce the damage per tick from this set by approximately 32%, increase the duration to 10 seconds up from 7. This is the third time that this has been nerfed on the 5 weeks of the PTS so far, so looking at a recent parse with it on Discord, it looks pretty far down on the list of damaging abilities. Only 2300 DPS from it and 2.1% of the overall DPS. Honestly, not really sure if this would be worth running at all. Stampede and Carve are still really good, but might be better to just backbar a 5-piece set like Pillar of Nirn if you're using a two-hander two-hander on the back bar. They keep nerfing this set for PvP reasons, so if it's going to end up this low overall, I think they should probably just change the function of it. Maybe some different form of a buff or a debuff on the enemies instead of a flat damage gain or a dot. Next up is Thunderous Volley. This is the Maelstrom Bow. Increase the ramping damage per stack to 191 up from 143 to help make this set stand up to others with its added requirement of the full duration dealing damage. So I have yet to have a chance to test this out. Interested to see how it stacks up with the other arena set options. Let me know in the comments if any of you have looked at it for this week 5 patch on the PTS. Next is Powerful Assault. It got a pretty nice buff as well. Increase the duration of this set to 15 seconds up from 10 to better match the durations of many of the morphs in the skill line. Increase the radius to 12 meters up from 10. So you'll still need to double cast this on a raid team if you want to hit all of your DPS, but they definitely made it a little bit easier to keep up than it was. Hey, I'll take the buffs to it. And then finally, for the last set that they changed, Mantle of Sorcerer, reduced the duration and cooldown of this set's AoE to 8 seconds, down from 10 seconds, to help it be slightly more mobile in encounters where you need to move. Increase the weapon and spell damage granted per stack to 63, up from 52, to ensure its high requirements are better rewarded. This set's 4-piece bonus is now 129 weapon and spell damage, rather than 1096 max magicka. Really nice buffs here for Sorcerer. This set has been outclassed ever since Rockgrove came out, especially since the hybridization of sets and everything. It just really hasn't had a place. Even if kept up perfectly, the damage from the set was not enough, especially with it having 2 max magicka lines on it. So now it's just the perfected line that's max magicka, similar to how Reliquin's perfected bonus is maximum stamina. So I haven't really seen too much so far with the testing on this set, but it does appear to be doing pretty good damage now if you can keep your stacks up. This will be perfect for those that don't want to mess with the resource game from Basai or Coral Riptide, as long as the encounter doesn't have too much movement to keep Sorcerer up. I think it will slide in nicely as having a spot among the top sets now though. So overall, while I don't think everything that we just went through is perfect, I do think these are mostly good changes. I'm pretty happy with what is here in the patch notes, which leads us to our next topic, what was left out of the patch notes. So what worries me the most is not anything that we just covered, but what was missing from this week. So we'll start off with the section over veteran content boss health adjustments. In the patch notes, it says dungeons, reduce the health of all bosses in veteran difficulty. Trials, reduce the health of all bosses, champions, and bannermen in veteran difficulty. Wow, I'll be honest, this just feels extremely disrespectful to the players. We have spent so much time on this PTS gathering data and putting so much effort into the feedback that we're submitting, and to have such vague patch notes here. The previous patch notes we went over are all fine, don't get me wrong. I just mean this particular section. They obviously have the numbers for this, but instead expect the player base to have to go on the PTS and search for ourselves. How are we going to get to Zalvaka hard mode? We have to get a PTS group together that can actually clear Oaks hard mode and then Basai hard mode. All that just to see a value that they could have written in. I don't know, this just really rubbed me the wrong way. And it does look like after players have gone through and checked some of the content that pretty much every boss is reduced by 10% health. Some are very slightly higher, some very slightly lower, but all seem to be based around that 10% health range. And Finn did have a response on Twitter where he confirmed that it would be a percent change mostly and generally would all fall along the same lines, which can be tested in game. There may be some outliers which are slightly higher or lower, but should be close to each other percent wise. So yeah, what it looks like is they did a blanket 10% nerf across the board on all veteran and veteran hard mode content. Yes, this includes Dreadcell Reef and Rockgrove hard mode, but it also includes Fungal Grotto 1 on veteran difficulty. I don't even know what to say really. It just feels like such a band-aid solution with them having their hand forced. There was this great opportunity to actually adjust the content piece by piece, especially considering that in the combat preview they said the reduction in health for each boss will vary from encounter to encounter, which led me and some others to believe that they would actually do some heavier adjustments on the newer content, which is a little more out of reach for most, while possibly barely touching the old stuff like Fungal Grotto 1 at all. I mean, that's what makes the most sense, right? Well, I reached out to a developer to get some feedback on this, and they gave kind of a snarky response about how the health amounts did vary from encounter to encounter because 10% health from a boss in Fungal Grotto is much lower than 10% from one in a newer hard mode trial. Yeah, I understand how percentages work, but it's still extremely misleading. So overall, I just feel like they really dropped the ball with this. For one, we had to dig in and do extra work because they didn't want to put 10% in the patch notes for some reason, even though they could have just put roughly 10% and stated that some might be slightly higher, some might be slightly lower. But then also, it just doesn't make sense as a solution. Pulling back our DPS and then hand adjusting content seemed like it could work, but if you just pull back the content by an even level across the board, what's the point of the DPS nerfs in the first place? Not to mention that we are down well over 10% DPS, so the nerfs don't even align with what we lost. I'm just extremely unsatisfied with both their solution and their presentation of the solution to the player base. I'd love to hear more from them on this and see a lot more work done in the future. But yeah, not gonna lie, this part frustrated me quite a bit. But that brings us to the second thing that was left out of the patch notes, and that is medium weaving. If you missed it, I covered what medium weaving was in last week's patch note review, so I won't be doing a close look at that. But essentially what it is a heavy attack that is not fully charged and therefore can be weaved close to the pace of a traditional light attack rotation. Since Empower now buffs heavy attacks by 80% but no longer touches light attacks, this creates a scenario where your medium weaves can do over double the damage of your light attack weaves. So if you are determined and want to get down a new style of play that involves medium attack weaving between each skill instead of light attack weaving, you actually see your highest potential results going down that path. In Goav's Magplar parse here, he got around 20k DPS from his medium attacks, and he had another parse that was a little bit lower overall, but the mediums came in at like 22k DPS. With a light attack rotation, the light attacks are going to give you somewhere in the 8 to 10k DPS range. So we're definitely looking at somewhere between like 10 to 14k extra DPS from medium attack weaving, depending on like how well you can do it and how fast you can keep the rotation. It definitely appears to just be an oversight with the new Empower changes, so I'm really hoping that something can happen in the next couple of weeks and this will not go live. I see two pretty easy solutions here. The first would be to just put light attacks back onto Empower. This would buff them up enough to where the difference in those and medium attacks would be so small that most people would go back to not bothering with medium weaving. And then the second solution would be to make Empower only apply to fully charged heavy attacks instead of allowing all heavy attacks, which include those medium weaves as well. At the bare minimum, I'd love to at least hear from Zos on this so we know what is intended. I'd hate to see a lot of people put in a bunch of time and effort, get this medium weaving down, and then it just gets nuked. So yeah, I'd feel really bad if a bunch of people wasted their time, and then they'd probably be more upset than they already are with the state of the game. So at least let people know so they're not practicing it. They're not like trying to really get that system down that they don't need to get down. So overall, I don't want to go out on all this negativity. Really, most of these patch notes were pretty good. And really just those last two topics about the boss health changes and medium weaving, those are the ones I'm really disappointed with the way that they addressed, or the lack of addressing them, I should say. We are without a doubt at least better in week 5 than we were on week 1 of the PTS. I just kind of prefer the way things are on the live servers overall. I think ultimately they tried to do way too much here in way too little time, and massive changes like these should be reserved for off-cycle test periods in the way that they have done occasionally in the past. Having the initial week of patch notes with only 4 weeks of changes following that is just not enough time for something of this scale, and it really showed this time around. I know I'm not the only one that is exhausted with all of this, and I'm frustrated, but at the end of the day, I think the game will still be fun to play. They've definitely corrected a lot of what was wrong with it. We're just going to have to sit through this patch that's going to be less than ideal and still need some more adjustments to get things in the right place. So you either do that or maybe you don't want to and you take a little break until update 36 to see what is planned there. So I'll still be here. I'll be around. I'll have my website updated for the Lost Depths DLC. I'll still put out videos on some various topics, but just letting y'all know I probably won't be doing any of these full hour-long DPS guides like I've done in the past for this update. I think I'll probably try and reserve those for update 36 when hopefully things are in a little bit better state. But that's going to wrap up this video. Let me know what you all think about the week 5 changes and if this is enough to keep you playing for update 35. If you haven't already subscribed to the channel, it definitely helps out a ton. It's free and you can always change your mind later if you're no longer interested in the content. Big thanks to my current Patreon supporters and YouTube members. Link is in the description if you're interested in helping out that way. And a special thanks to Nicholas, Simon, Cougars Bay and the Cougar City Guild, the Order of War Guild, Iffy, Cantankerous Cat, Shady, Blake Win 816, Mordecai 1212, Santanico, Nalandia, Garcia, Hayat Spork, Florian, Vidridi, and Cha-Cha. Thanks again for stopping by. I'll see y'all in the next one. Bye.